everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I just want to say thank you to Marianne and Boris and to the whole Erste Foundation. This is a terrific event. And I also just want to warn you, this is very cool. I think it's too cool for me, so you're just going to have to, be sympathetic. I want to start by proposing a thought experiment. Think about one bee. Oh, that bee's left. Never mind, the bee that was there. And you'll say, one bee, that's ridiculous. There's no such thing as one bee. And you're right. If bees could philosophize, they themselves would explain to us that a single bee is no bee. Bees are always en masse, a bee nation, a muster of bees, a commonwealth of bees, a collocation of bees, groups that erase the individual bee and consign her simply to a category based on her current work assignment. There are only lots of bees. So the truth is you can't really think about just one bee. But take one bee anyway. Let's call her Melissa, which means honeybee in Greek. And consider Melissa as she grows. She's building comb, she's feeding the larval bees, she's guarding the hive, foraging for pollen and nectar, she's doing the waggle dance and the round dance. And now pretend that she's particular and personal. Imagine that she chooses all these tasks, or at least that she has a view about them. Then pretend that she takes the long view of herself and everything she does, that she understands her small and identical contribution to the civic well-being that she enjoys with her tens of thousands of sister citizens, that she's perpetuating the life of the hive, a hive whose own institutional history is hundreds or even thousands of times longer than her own. One that, unlike her history, stretches over seasons and even years. Imagine Melissa the bee actually has some inkling of her role in the health of ecosystems, which we know she does, in the local economy of the hive, which we know she does, and, in human economy. You, her contemplator, are completely unlike Melissa. But imagine, nevertheless, that like her, or like you, this one bee, Melissa, has experience, information, and in her case, just a little bit of memory. And then think what it would mean for her and for us to forget all about that, to forget how to be a bee, for us to forget how to be ourselves. Colony collapse disorder, or CCD, was first reported in 2006 in Pennsylvania. A beekeeper lost 50% of his hives suddenly and for no obvious reason. They were just gone. Everything was gone. This event was almost certainly not the first of its kind, and soon afterwards the major US pollination services, who transport thousands of hives and billions of bees all over the continental United States to service big agriculture from Georgia to California. These pollination services were reporting 50 to 90% die-off among their beehives in various parts of the country. By 2007, CCD was occurring throughout Europe, and shortly afterwards it got to Asia. Typically what happens is the beekeeper opens the hives one day and finds that the worker bees are gone, and yet the combs are undamaged, they're full of capped brood, the larval bees, and stored with honey and pollen. And the queen also remains healthy, apparently. There's no telltale sign of disease or attack or environmental crisis. There are no dead bees lying around, and there's no clue at all about where the missing bees have gone. In the UK, CCD has been called Marie Celeste syndrome after the famous case of the mysteriously empty ship found off the Azores in 1872 that showed signs of utterly normal shipboard life until the moment of abandonment. In the US, CCD has been dubbed bee-apocalypse. The theological alarmists see in this event the imminence of the rapture and the end of days. CCD, this really spooky epidemic in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, threatens the billions of dollars and euros in agricultural revenues that depend on pollinating services of millions and millions of bees. UK honeybees and bumblebees pollinate at least 70 crops worth £700 million. European bees pollinate 153 billion euros worth of crops. In America, bees service $24 billion and 58 plant species. The California almond crop alone is sustained by the work of more than 1 million hives, and each hive has 30 to 50,000 bees in it, so do the math. So far, after 20 years of research on this calamity, still no one knows what causes CCD. There are lots of theories. The role of agricultural herbicides and pesticides in this catastrophic phenomenon is suspected, but by no means established. Could a particular and widely used chemical alone, perhaps from the neonicotinoid group, also known as neonics, or glyphosate, an organophosphate, or their use in concert with other bee stressors, or some other culprit entirely, be killing off suddenly whole bee populations? Neonics and glyphosate are both herbicides and pesticides. The companies that invented them have conveniently produced genetically modified crops that can be sprayed with them to kill insects, but not the crops themselves. And these modified crops are generally called Roundup Ready, after the most famous brand of neonic. And to me, there's something very sinister about inventing a poison to kill plants, and then inventing a plant that resists that poison so that the plant itself can kill insects. Kind of Frankenstein stuff. I recently surveyed 20 articles or so in peer-reviewed science journals published between 2015 and 2022, and these are the many contradictory conclusions that I found. 1, neonics and glyphosate are toxic to bees. 2, neonics and glyphosate are sublethal, but do not kill bees, but they do disrupt apian social behavior by interfering with memory, navigation, orientation, olfaction, and foraging behaviors. 3, the villains are not herbicides at all, or pesticides, but bee parasites, like the Nosema virus and the Varroa destructor mite. 4, loss of habitat and the rise of monoculture reduces apian adaptability and may also cause nutritional deficiencies. 5, some other pathogen may be killing bees. 6, glyphosate, which is a key ingredient in Roundup and other neonic products, destroys beneficial gut bacteria in bees and makes them susceptible to pathogens. 7, bees lack genetic diversity because of breeding programs to produce mass commercial pollinators. All these are possible causes of CCD, but if they are, no one has any idea why they can collapse a colony almost instantly, and no one knows where the bees go or where they die. The most widely used commercial neonicotinoid is imidacloprid and its clones. I'm really glad I can say that. Imidacloprid and its clones. These are chemicals that synthetically mimic the nicotine that many plants have already evolved naturally as an anti-herbivore defense. Imidacloprid is one of those bizarre, threatening names typical of pharmaceutical and biochemical corporate products, like medicines that you take if you look at the generic word. They're really weird. They christen their mysterious chemicals with these unpronounceable words that seem to be conjured by extraterrestrial branding specialists. In its commercial form, however, and that's the form that we see on the shelf, imidacloprid has much more heroic and humane names: Confidor, Kohinoor, Merit, Admire, Provado, Advocate, Gaucho, Roundup. And like me, you may have put these in your gardens at one point or another, likely made by Bayer, Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and other corporate giants. Imidacloprid, with or without glyphosate, is absorbed by plants and acts as a neurotoxin ingested by boring and sucking insects and other invertebrates, in whom it is ultimately lethal. They die of paralysis. It appears so far to be somewhat less damaging to mammals, although there is some evidence of birth defects and developmental damage. The jury is still out on that. But honeybees gather excreted substances from the surface of plant organs and should therefore be less vulnerable to imidacloprid. They don't bore or suck the plants. Must a bee ingest these chemicals to be affected by them, or does mere contact with them do the same harm? We just don't know, since bees and other pollinators drink nectar and eat pollen, which they also carry back to the hive. That's a bee covered with pollen. It's been foraging. I think that's particularly good. You can see how much pollen they get on themselves. Neonics and glyphosate, without question, produce chronic effects in bees in controlled lab experiments, including reduced immune response, compromised learning ability, memory, and spatial orientation. Notably, in exposed bees, they disrupt the waggle dance. This is one of the dances observed in forager bees returning to the hive, by which they explain to other bees where they found food sources. The waggle dance and the round dance encode direction and distance to guide sister bees to food. Bee dances, in other words, are absolutely crucial to the well-being of the colony. But in exposed bees, neonic and glyphosate alter the dances so that the dancing bee spreads fatal misinformation in the hive. These are what are charmingly called, as I said before, sublethal effects, because neonics and glyphosate interfere with the bee brain but do not kill bees directly. They don't drop dead of paralysis. Instead, these chemicals produce impairments. The bees can't remember what food smells like or how to reach it if they do, and if they reach it, their homing instinct fails. They forget their way back to the hive. If imidacloprid is indeed a culprit, it works by stealth, subtly disabling the whole colony and exposed to it by making it unable to function normally. Eventually, so the theory goes, the colony surrenders to these chemically induced symptoms. The term sublethal is a horrible euphemism. Imidacloprid doesn't kill them outright, but they die of it in the end. It is a kind of zombie chemical that turns bees into idiots. Other research, however, tells a different story. Imidacloprid is by no means the clear and single culprit, even though we do know it damages pollinators. The agrochemical manufacturers who profit from Roundup and gaucho defend their products by pointing out rightly that countries like Australia, where they are heavily used, have no CCD at all. Australia also has no varroa mite epidemic either, and it is this parasitic killer, the companies claim, that is much more likely to be the cause of CCD in the northern hemisphere, where varroa destructor is now endemic. Although the argument is scientific, it has become the property of public relations. Gaucho, Roundup, imidacloprid, these different names suggest both the swashbuckling cowboy and the sinister lab creation. And they've become the chemical bogeyman for opponents of corporate industrial power who are fighting against big food. Monsanto and Syngenta and the rest are powerful opponents and have been very willing to spend billions to disprove any responsibility for the damaging side effects of industrial food production. But it defies common sense that a powerful herbicide and insecticide only selectively kills species we identify as pests and is wholly benign to others whom we cherish. Neonics, after all, affect wasps, beetles, and other pest predators, as well as pollinators like butterflies, bumblebees, and other invertebrates such as ladybirds, earthworms, and nematodes. We tend to forget that the designation pest, like the designation weeds, which are really just flowers in the wrong place, that designation pest is not a meaningful biological category at all, but a socially determined one, determined by our needs. The real power of imidacloprid and the debate about CCD is not whether the chemical harms bees. It clearly does. And the question is simply how much, and what should be done about it. Its true, and for me, much more terrifying power is its appeal to our need for convenient and tidy symbols that contain our anger and fear, ones by which we can, at least psychologically, control and simplify the complex problems of the world by identifying just a single villain or source that can be eradicated. If only the problem were just Roundup, and Roundup alone, a single agent, which, a bit like DDT or fluorocarbons, would be a problem we could legislate out of existence. There is naturally a more obvious but much more disquieting answer to the CCD mystery. It's not really a pesticide that's killing bees. It's the way we live now. Driven by our intemperate demand for ever cheaper and ever more abundant food through intensive farming, its monoculture, and the universal use of pesticides that sustain these practices, we present bees with diminishing forage and insufficiently understood assaults on their immune and neurological systems. And global trade spread of the Varroa destructor mite and the Nosema virus, and indeed other bee parasites, in major bee populations is the third whammy in this 1, 2, 3 punch. Add other challenges such as changing weather patterns and extreme climate variation, and for bees working in commercial pollinator services, the debilitating effects of being moved around vast areas when crops are in flower, and we find that bees are in special peril from man-made technologies and practices which they are not evolved to withstand. So what we admire in their astonishingly complex social arrangements opens them exactly to disaster from small mutations in environment and behavior, mutations whose equally complex origins are hard to isolate and identify. Apian complexity mirrors our own. Bee society can be fractured by damage to just one of its many linked operations. So also the vast and intricate food chain on which we ourselves depend from soil to supermarket, not to mention the profound cultural conditioning that teaches us to expect that to have whatever we want, whenever we want it, will be radically disrupted by the withdrawal of this single chemical and by the absence of this single pollinator species. In other words, anthropogenic damage cannot be isolated in one convenient malefactor. So, we return to Melissa, our 1B. The word economy comes from a Greek root, oikos, or household, and so does the word ecology. Economic and ecological ideas are philologically identical, both based on a domestic idea of good and orderly housekeeping. The beehive has for millennia been an emblem of household economy. And as in a household, when chores are neglected, the edifice of the hive decays and the system eventually breaks down. In a healthy colony of Apis mellifera, a mature bee lives to be about 6 weeks old. No single bee, other than those few who overwinter with the queen to restart the hive's perpetual honey industry in the spring, witnesses the full fashioning of the hive from nectar flow to first frost. Each bee dies after a pitifully brief span of incessant economic labor. And what a bee knows, remembers, and contributes, she achieves it and passes it on not singly but communally, through pheromones, instinct, and dancing. Each bee remembers where she last found food, and remembers the dance code for sharing her information with the hive. But beyond these unique experiences of discovering nectar and pollen here and there, each bee's tiny history is like every other bee's. The memory of bees is collective. It consists of millions of repetitions, and the hive's oikos survives on the joined biological memory of millions of individuals with hardly any individual memory at all. Unless she's killed, Melissa and every other bee dies of overwork. But if one living bee loses her biological instinctual legacy, chances are the whole hive will lose it. When one bee dies of disease, mutation, intervention, or poisoning, the hive dies. If one bee is no bee, according to the proverb, then one bee is every bee. One bee is all bees. The hive and ultimately all bees live or die together. Bees cannot forget the epidemic of domestic hive failures around the world because they have no notion at all of colony collapse disorder. But a bee can forget her tasks. Without memory, her work remains undone. As we know from our own experience in the late industrial world of information, transport, and industry, a single failure in a complex system creates general havoc. The more complexity, the more chaos. Nothing happens to one bee alone in the social reticulation of the hive. If the controlled studies are correct, whatever the causes of CCD turn out to be, it may be that a fatal amnesia is what we've done to bees with our chemistry and our demands upon the world we share with them. CCD is, above all, a memory disorder. We've turned bees into zombies. We've made bees forget. Thank you.